Good morning, good day. Hello, everybody. It's great to see everyone as always. Great to have you here joining us. Um, my name is Sam Carter. I'm research associate here with the Housing Commons Research Center. And as always, we are excited to greet you and welcome you for today's session. Um, Much thanks everybody for being so prompt, right on the dot. I am seeing that, just in these first few moments, people are keep on filtering in. So we'll just give it a quick second to settle in. Um, but we will get started really momentarily. Um, I'm going to go through introductions and stuff. So uh, we'll get to the full thing uh, as we start. But said, my name's Sam, and I'm excited to be joined today by Karen Kubey and Dr. Susannah Bunce um, for what I think is going to be a really exciting and interesting conversation. Um, I think, I mean, we'll just get started.
Start?
People will
Yeah.
filter in. Yeah, let's just go. Okay, okay.
Let's jump into it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like stalling for what are we stalling for? No, we can go. All right. So I'm just going to bring up a few slides to sort of help set the context and get ourselves oriented, situated here. Um, and yeah, so as you can see, the title of today's session is on bricks, bonds, and belonging, conversation that will revolve around the material and relational theories of the commons. And before we really get into it, again, just going to sort of situate us with the land acknowledgement. You see on the screen here, we have the land acknowledgement, but I want to offer a few sort of thoughts and my own reflections here. And so typically I'm based in downtown Toronto, right? This is the land of Toronto Purchase. This is Treaty 13 land, the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Um, and as for myself, my ancestors came here as settlers fleeing anti-Semitism from Eastern Europe. And before them, they came in bondage during this transatlantic slave trade. Long before that, though, this land was the subject of the dish with one spoon wampum belt covenant, which sets out a particularly relevant premise for the conversation we're going to host today. That we all have a collective responsibility to the land, to each other, and to all of those who swim, crawl, and fly. This responsibility that we share is to care for and steward this life giving resource, the land, the sky, the waters that we share. And I think it's just important to ground and open our conversation by recognizing that wisdom, the contributions and sacrifices of all of those who have come before us, and all of this with a deep respect for all life, all of the living beings, all of our relations that we share this place with. So, with that in mind, let's sort of get into our content for today. So, my journey in higher education, eventually into planning, began actually in political philosophy. And throughout my journey, I've always held on to this idea of urban planning as applied philosophy, not just how should we organize theoretically, but practically, how do our cities actually perform? And so importantly, how do we work to translate the ethics and ideals into the social and material culture of the communities we live in? So for today's conversation, as I said at the top there, we're going to be talking about bricks, bonds, and belonging. And to host, to drive this conversation, we're bringing together two people who I've had the pleasure of working with and whose working contributions I deeply respect. I've had the pleasure of working alongside Susannah Bunce and more and more frequently, hopefully increasingly so, with Karen Kubey. And I'm always struck by the clarity and care that they bring to these questions around housing, land, and design. What I appreciate in both Karen and Susannah's approaches is a willingness to sit with the complexity and push beyond easy narratives about what housing should be towards an honest and pragmatic, clear eyed consideration of what our housing systems actually are and where there are opportunities for meaningful impact. As we move into today's session, I want to take a moment then to just set the table, particularly around this idea of the commons. So when we talk about the commons, we could be talking about all kinds of things. We might be referring to shared land, collective ownership or governance strategies, social relationships, practices of care, and other big, lofty ideals about what it means to belong and our shared responsibilities. It could just as easily be a corporate tagline for a new condo development or a real estate investment opportunity. And this is part of what makes our conversation today so interesting and necessary. That depending on who you're talking to, these ideas of the commons do not always align neatly, either conceptually or in practice. And so, with that thought in mind, then we return to the commons. As I've said, this idea gets tossed a lot around quite casually a lot these days. Housing and planning, design, marketing, and in ways that are often quite expansive. Sometimes it's a productive contribution, and sometimes in ways that risk flattening the important distinctions and differences, obscuring context and clouding the conversation. So rather than trying to define the commons too tightly, what I want to offer is a suggestion that for our conversation today, at least, we take it as a working concept, something that we can use to open up questions rather than close them down. So with all that said, again, center productive tension for our conversation. And let's consider this an invitation to get a little spicy, be a little provocative as we think about what feels useful about the concept of the commons today, what might be overstretched or taken for granted. Where do we see the commons, that is, community-led commons, having real impact, and where might the commons be misunderstood or even misapplied in our broader housing conversations? So, to get into things, I'm going to start with some quick introductions, and then we'll get into the meat of the conversation today. Ultimately, what we're interested in is not just that idea, theoretically, of the commons, but how theory translates to practice in the built environment and in our everyday lives. So I'm going to drop these slides for a second and just introduce our speakers today. So I, again, have the great pleasure of being joined by Dr. Susannah Bunce, who's an associate professor in the Department of Human Geography, UTSC, that's the University of Toronto Scarborough. Dr. Bunce is the co-director of the New Housing Alternatives Partnership and co-lead of our very own Housing Commons Research Center, otherwise known as the New Housing Alternatives Research Cluster. Dr. Bunce's research centers on the geographies of planning and urban communities and neighborhoods and sustainable community building. She engages with critical theories of urban commons and alternatives, gentrification, environmental justice, urban political ecology, and more than human geographies to examine localized issues and politics of land use, community-based socio-environmental identifications, and community-based socio-environmental identifications with local spaces. She's also interested in contestations caused by gentrification and other housing land-based struggles. Her research focuses on insurgent responses and more hopeful, future-oriented, community-engaged practices, particularly those that relate to affordable and equitable land stewardship, such as urban community land trusts and urban eco-villages. Welcome, Dr. Bunce, Susannah. Karen Kubey is an assistant professor of architecture at the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture and Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto in the downtown campus. She's also the founding director of the Architecture and Housing Justice Lab. And Karen Kubey is a New York and Toronto-based urbanist specializing in housing design and spatial justice. She's the editor of the Housing as Intervention, Architecture Towards Social Equity, which is an architectural design publication from 2018. She served as the first ED, executive director of the Institute for Public Architecture, also co-founded the New York chapter of the Architecture for Humanity, which is now known as the Open Architecture New York organization, co-founded and led the New Housing New York Design Competition, among many other things, I'm sure. Her work brings together architects, policy, finance experts, and community leaders to develop projects that contribute to more equitable housing and neighborhoods. She got degrees in architecture from University of California, Berkeley, Columbia University of Graduate Design. I'm going to go through, flex it. I'm happy to big you up. Planning and preservation program. Kubey began her career as designer below market housing. She's received support from New York State Council on the Arts, MacDowell, Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. She's completed a Fulbright scholarship in the States, the Universidad Portuccio de Tella in Buenos Aires. I'm not very good at Spanish. I can do many things, but that one's not one of them. And is currently assistant professor of architecture at U of T. She's taught at the Pratt Institute, Columbia. The list goes on and on. Um, I could continue, but I want to hear what these wonderful people have to say. So I think with that, um, I will pass it over to you, Karen. Please take it away. Excited to hear what we're going to get into today.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the generous introduction. I'll share my screen. When I heard that there was a Housing Commons Research Center, I thought this is a dream. I want to be connected with this group, so it's a pleasure to connect with you. So I'm going to be presenting a case study of, my work asks questions about the role of architecture and architects in working toward housing justice. So I'll be presenting today a case study of a speculative project that I worked on with a team. So I hope we can have a discussion both about this project and about the role of speculative architecture in these questions in general. So I'll be talking about aging against the machine. What you might notice on this first slide is that my name is one of very many. I'm one member of a large team that worked on this project. I co-led the design with other architects and urban designers, Raj Bhatia and Ignacio Galan, working with local and other experts, and most importantly, resident collaborators. And at the time, I was at Pratt, and so we were also developing this project alongside 3 studios. It was pretty complicated. Okay, and Sam did an amazing job of introducing me. So these are my 3 main current affiliations: at the University of Toronto, directing the Architecture and Housing Justice Lab, and convening the American Institute of Architects Right to Housing Working Group. And here's a book that I put out a little while ago that still informs my work. So the argument behind the work I'm showing today, Aging Against the Machine, is that aging is not a problem to be solved. The problem is the range of barriers, physical, social, financial, and cultural, that make it difficult to grow older with dignity and in community. So our project addresses living in West Oakland from an intersectional perspective with a focus on aging. And this is a shot from an installation from the exhibition that we are a part of. So we were a part of, this was originally produced for, speaking of the Commons, an exhibition called Reset Towards a New Commons. This is something that was held in New York at the Center for Architecture, and our team was one of 4 across the United States that was selected as part of a national open call. And so all of the teams were interdisciplinary, and for us, it was really critical when we were choosing what we wanted to work on. It was critical for us to take on a personal topic, and critical for us to pick a site where we could work closely with on-the-ground groups and residents. And I should say, this was already a personal topic, the question of aging, and it's become more so, as my parents have gone through health challenges in the last couple of years. And I'm from California originally, and one of our team members was there, our core team members. So that was an opportunity for us. And so this is, like I said, it was developed alongside 3 different design studios. It was 14 months, bi-coastal, and here's a shot of the opening. Okay, so there won't be sound here. That's on purpose. So it was important to us. Let's hope it goes. It was important to us not to present the site as neutral, as might be the case in some schemes, but to show it through the eyes of local residents. So this is an excerpt from a film that opened our installation that we did walking with David Peters, who runs the Black Liberation Walking Tour. And you're seeing an image of an interview, or a clip of an interview with a resident named Annette Miller, who's one of many people who she and her neighbors fought against the banks to keep her home from being foreclosed so she could stay in the neighborhood. So our project is situated along the San Pablo corridor in West Oakland. West Oakland is, and you're seeing one of the side streets, which is where you'll see some of our interventions later on. So this is a neighborhood with strong cultural and racial diversity, an historically Black neighborhood in which older residents face precarious living conditions as a result of decades of disinvestment and the legacies of redlining. But at the same time, the neighborhood has long been a testing ground of a civil rights movement, countercultural communities, where residents have worked to build alternatives to mutual aid and solidarity networks, programs by the Black Panthers Party, resources by the Center for Independent Living. So this is just in the neighboring city of Berkeley. This is an organization that was really at the forefront of fights for disability justice. And so in terms of, the working at the level of the commons has been a necessity in this neighborhood because, there wasn't proper, and there isn't still proper government funding. But this is not just an historical phenomenon at all. There are more recent individual and collective initiatives that responded to the crisis of affordability that's affecting the region and that continue to shape the neighborhood. So we worked most closely with the East Bay Asian Local Development Corporation. You'll hear me refer to that as EBALDC. So the East Bay Asian Local Development Corporation has been around for decades. Per their name, they originally focused on working with Asian residents, and now they work with everyone, and they have deep community ties. But these, also working with WOCAN and Spark, there's a lot of amazing work happening now. So our project builds on these different past and ongoing initiatives. And in terms of methods, we work first through historical research, incorporating both archival information, and then also looking more recently, we had a 14-month engagement, which is kind of long, but not long enough. And so it was critical to us to build on longstanding neighborhood engagement of our partner organizations. And so we very carefully went through the reports of, community engagement sessions that have happened recently. But we didn't stop there. We also we had our own meetings, some of which were led by the students we were working with. So we had different sessions. Some of them were having conversations with older residents. Some of them were, you'll see Walter Hood here, the landscape architect. We were talking with librarians, housing advocates, pastors, etc., to unveil their goals and their longstanding fights. And, this was sort of interesting. We were doing lots of academic research. We were reading Silvia Federici and thinking about, her argument for the need for solidarity between people of different age groups. But we realized pretty quickly that, what we were hearing from residents directly was better and more important than that. Specifically, just as she's talking about solidarity across ages, when we asked older people, hey, what do you need? What's important for you in the neighborhood? The very first thing they said was, well, the kids need this, the kids need that. So this idea is absolutely not theoretical at all. It's coming from what we're hearing from residents. So our work revealed the challenges faced by older residents, and we argue that these are integral to fights for social, racial, economic, and environmental justice that are being fought from within the neighborhood and often led by older people and their caregivers. So it was important to us to work in solidarity with these different people and initiatives. And then what are we not doing? So we're questioning the role of the architect as an ally of the curing and policing state. And so you'll see that none of our interventions are segregated ones like you might see here. So instead, our projects seek to make visible, connect, and expand past and ongoing initiatives. And they're bringing a lot of different voices together. So just to show you, looking at our installation, this is, you saw a clip from this video that opens it. We had a series of 7 speculative interventions alongside narratives that talk about what this would mean in the lives of residents, some models of our projects, and examples of the archival and different kinds of research we were doing. So if we zoom in, we can see that these are the fictional narratives. And, just as our research was going, our process was going back and forth between the archival research and design ideas. We wanted the table to do the same thing, and showing, also that this doesn't all have to be, reinventing the wheel. Even in the last 10 years, there's been an explosion of really excellent products, et cetera, that can be very helpful as people age in place. So I'm going to go quickly through highlights from our 7 interventions. So first, at a smaller scale, we imagine a set of information, spatial transformation, that focus on existing building stock. So this would be inside one of the sort of, 2-story-ish Victorian homes like you saw in that film. So thinking about what does it really take for someone who's getting older to stay in her home. So, there may be mobility challenges, but also economic ones, right? So what we're looking at here is an idea of retrofitting a home to make it easier for people who have mobility challenges to navigate. And we're specifically not doing this in an institutional way. We're not bringing in like a grab bar from a nursing home. We're instead, using, sort of normal furniture and making it work in that way. But then thinking, that's not enough. There's an economic question. So as in all of our proposals, we're just sort of dialing up what already exists. So there already exists a program in Berkeley nearby that places students with older residents. So we're imagining building an accessory dwelling unit onto her property that could then be rented out and bring in a little income. I had the opportunity years ago to work with the City of New York to write the Aging in Place Guide for building owners. So we were drawing from technical solutions there. And then, like I said, thinking about off-the-shelf solutions that could be helpful. Then moving into the idea of linking existing houses with a system of elevated porches shared among several single-family homes. So here we're responding to the fact that, it just, in terms of logistics and funding, it might not be possible for one home, one resident to do this, but working together might be possible. So here we were inspired directly by a 1980s publication by the Center for Independent Living called Ramps Are Beautiful, which was a knowledge sharing platform supporting disabled people to live away from institutions and in the community. So, there are, of course, criticisms of the Center for Independent Living that often overlook the needs of typically poor neighbors in Oakland, but there are exceptions to that. And one critical example is the figure of Brad Lomax, who was a disabled member of the Black Panthers Party, who helped to bring together those struggles. So following the idea of coming from the center, it's meant to make it possible for people to build these sort of DIY style. And one of the questions that the publication asks is how to finance a ramp. Again, making this feasible. And I'm going to go a little bit more quickly looking at time. So then, there's a lot of healthcare infrastructure in the neighborhood. We're also interested in the Black Panthers SAFE program, which is Seniors Against a Fearful Environment. So building on that idea to have a series of community vans, these will be funded by the hospitals, but run by local groups. And you're seeing, one of the big challenges in our neighborhood is this is the San Pablo Avenue that I mentioned. This has been around. This is originally indigenous path. But you see a lot of these irregular sites that can be hard to build on. So thinking about those being an area where the buses could park. And then going number 4 is the San Pablo Avenue transformation. So the city, this is what you're seeing on the lower right, is the city's ideas about making that safer. We riff on that and have an idea of really greening the street and having these 4 green medians with different amenities so that you don't have to cross more than 12 feet before you can rest. So we were working with, I showed you we had a big team. One of the people was Elizabeth Goldman, who is an aging in place expert. And over and over and over again, she said to us, listen, if you care about older people, you have to care about caregivers. And this is, of course, the plight of caregivers who are underpaid and often having to travel too far is, of course, a feminist issue, an issue faced primarily, the fight led by women of color. So we're proposing a new typology. This is extending the work of Ibaldi for an intergenerational co-housing model based on alternative models that are already tested in the neighborhood. So this is a prototype for a new building in a site along San Pablo that would include housing not only for older people, but also caregivers and their families or households, and supporting both normal apartments and also apartments where more of your life happens in the commons. Scene 6 is maybe my favorite because the larger affordability crisis is unfortunately disproportionately faced by older residents. There are a lot of older people who are experiencing homelessness. It's a really horrible situation. So what we wanted to do was we were inspired by the Homes Guarantee, which is a US-wide platform developed by a multiracial coalition of more than 1 million grassroots leaders. This is a rights-based platform, and asking the question of what would it take not just to tinker at the edges of the housing crisis, but to end the housing crisis, to end homelessness. At the heart of their proposal is 12 million units of social housing, new and renovated. I don't know what 12 million means. I can't conceptualize that, but doing quick math, that would be 1,600 healthy carbon-free homes in new and renovated, which is buildings in West Oakland. So these are real sites we're showing that could be developed without displacing people. And this is, just a quick sketch of what this might look like, looking at this as a resident-led process. And then last but not least, zooming in to a community land trust. So we know that community land trusts have gained steam in the Bay Area. We're imagining that there's a West Oakland one, building on the work of Moms for Housing, which is a group of homeless and precariously housed Black mothers who have successfully taken over buildings from the banks. And so we're thinking about a CLT that would acquire vacant and undervalued land using city funding, credit union loans, and donations. So I went very quickly. What's great about this exhibition is that there's an excellent digital record of it. Next door to us was another scheme that's looking at the scale of block from the point of view of disabled residents. And we've written a chapter in a new book, Architectures of Aging in Place, that extend this. So it was important to us not to approach aging as a problem to be solved, but rather to address the barriers and make it difficult to grow older in the neighborhood. And we understand architecture only as exercising agency in alliance with other agents and organizations and solidarity with other initiatives. I'll do a quick PS on how this is coming into my research. So, my newer research is under the umbrella of the Architecture and Housing Justice Lab, which is a hub for architects, urbanists, designers, and the public to join in the fight for housing justice. I'm lucky to be part of End Housing Alienation Now. This is a super studio bringing together, I think, 18 different architecture studios across the country. My thesis, we're having a review in a few days, is architecture and the right to housing, working with master's students. And so I invite you to um, uh, look at this website soon. This is a website that's going to share work from across Canada, and ours will be up sometime in May. So I will stop there. Thanks so much.
Gosh, thank you, Karen. Um, really quickly, I'll say that I'm actually at another one of the Super Studio critiques today, so I'll be joining them to see more of it. It's super exciting to see all of that work. But just on what you shared, it's I think so important to center our elders in these conversations is vital even. And I mean, simply put, because I think we should all hope to become elders one day and should be able to look forward to that without concern about our stability, our care, our communities, to be able to live and look forward to dignity. It also brings together, as you mentioned, so many intersecting lenses, racial, gender, economic, environmental considerations. So thank you so much for sharing that work and all of the work that you do. It's really wonderful to have you with us. Now, moving along to our other wonderful guest, Dr. Susannah Bunce. I guess I've got your slides here, so just give me a
Yeah,
moment and I will bring
thanks.
those up for you. Where did my button go? There we go. And
Thanks, Sam.
here we go.
Great. Okay, thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks to Sam for setting up a great introduction and to Karen for that really fascinating and important presentation. And to everyone for coming today. It's nice to see all, not your faces, but your names in the sidebars. So thanks for being here. So I'll be connecting with some of the themes of Karen's presentation through a focus on different ideas of commons in theory and practice, and also the merits and challenges of commons and commoning, which Sam positioned in his introduction. And also with a few photographs from time I spent in Senegal and the Gambia and West Africa earlier this year, which I'll show in a bit. So I'm currently working on the beginning of a research and writing project on diverse meanings of and global engagements with housing commons. So my notes here and the photographs reflect the very early start of thinking through this project. So I'd be grateful for your feedback, your thoughts in the question and answer period at the end of our time today. So I know we have a time limit, so I'll jump right in. So I'd like to begin with the notion that the idea of commons reflects the importance of collective relationship building and relational connectivity that grounds a spectrum of communal alternatives for housing and living. So in an everyday way, commons can be understood in terms of daily collective practices and spaces, where these practices happen, what we have in common with people, why, how, and what we share between us, intentional common objectives and goals, and how we make everyday decisions between ourselves and in relation to the spaces we live in. In making a distinction between commons and commoning, commons can be understood as the places and spaces that we engage in and with and within, and commoning can be understood as the relational processes that happen between us to produce common spaces through decision-making, collaboration, cooperation, and coordination. Connected with these everyday understandings of commons are different theories of what commons broadly means, or more specifically, how different forms of commons produce different outcomes in connection to ideas of how we best act in collective ways. So theories of commons also address the challenges and tensions of acting collectively, which Sam also positioned as an important practice in the introduction today. So modern theories of commons originate in debates over how communities share resources. The notion of the tragedy of the commons, which we've heard and we hear a lot about over a number of decades, was put forward by American ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968 to argue that when given resources to manage collectively and left without oversight from governmental regulations, human beings will act in their own self-interest rather than for a common or shared objective or good, ultimately leading to the depletion of resources. So to counter this argument, Eleanor Ostrom, an American political scientist, wrote Governing the Commons in 1990, a very influential book, which provided examples of communities that act with common purpose and share common resources, such as pastoral communities with shared farmland, for example. Ostrom's more optimistic vision of collective living provided much needed groundwork for more contemporary thinking about diverse forms of commons. So more contemporary theories of commons tend to be aspirational and future focused, exploring what types of communities we want to live in, what types of kinships and solidarities we want to create, about hope for a better and more equitable future, and importantly, about ways to dismantle the multiple crises or the polycrises produced by capitalism and colonial histories. So I'll briefly mention some recent perspectives on commons here, starting with feminist scholar Silvia Federici, who Karen just mentioned in her talk, and Federici's colleague, George Kafentzis. So they write of commons in the context of a post-capitalist future and define a post-capitalist commons as the creation of autonomous spaces, both material and relational, through which to reclaim control over the way we live and work, and as spaces for collective and egalitarian decision-making that empowers individuals as part of communities. In terms of an environmental commons, environmental law academic Burns Weston and environmental activist David Bollier posited the increasing necessity for forms of green commons or environmental commons based on rights-based ecological governance and the reconstitution of human relationships with nature in the face of climate crisis. So the creation of a green commons is discussed in research on community gardens, rewilding, and ecosystem regeneration, for example, in a broader context. Geographer J.T. Rohn writes about the needs for Black commons that underline the possibilities and actions for survival, connection, and insurgency for Black communities. He connects this with the necessity of repairing Black community relationships with land and the natural environment, and sees commons as a way to reclaim connections with these for Black communities, connections which were eradicated through centuries of colonialism and enslavement. And so these ideas were also put forward in the first session of this webinar series by Sam Carter-Shemai and David Darrell Cuba on histories of Black land stewardship in the United States. The work on Black commons ties a critical idea of commons with a deep connection to relationality and connects it with the understandings of racial, social, and environmental justice. Anishinaabe scholar Deborah McGregor writes about relationality in terms of environmental injustice for Indigenous people. So Indigenous environmental justice are the inherent ties between all relations, a meaning of living well with the world and caring for the well-being of other persons. There are intrinsically more than human and grounded in caring relationships with land, water, and all living beings. So these are critical ideas for Indigenous land sovereignty and the inclusion of more than human beings in ideas of collectivity. So the more than human beings that make up our world. These are inspirational theories of commons that help to guide a discussion of the meaning of housing commons. So moving on to the idea of housing commons, we can see this is grounded in the decommodification of private property and finding ways to transform our current system of profit making from housing. An understanding of housing commons should bring land and housing together in supporting alternative ways of living that both stand up to and depart from the market-driven property system through cooperative and community-led models. So current examples being cooperatives, community land trusts, which Karen just mentioned, and eco-villages, all of which offer ways to rethink and resist our current system of individualized property ownership. So as Sam suggested in his opening slide, it's also important to problematize ideas of commons and commoning, which my work is also attempting to do. And as we know, commons is an English term that has its roots in laws around land held in common in Britain, historically by farmers without title to land. And within this history, commons also has critical grounding in relation to processes of enclosures. So enclosures of commonly used farmland into rented or privately owned land occurred more quickly through government acts from the mid-18th century onwards, and were instigated by encroaching industrialization and the extractive imperatives of British colonialism. So currently only 3% of land in Britain today is designated as common land. Yet the process of common land enclosure over centuries has also been marked by multiple anti-enclosure revolts and rebellions by people using common land. And many of these resistance efforts have been led by women over centuries. This historical connection between commons and enclosure has current relevance for thinking about commons as a liminal process. where the enclosing of commons is always there, either happening in real time or hanging over us in a simultaneous push-pull process. So the contemporary co-optation of the word commons to name privatized for profit spaces is a form of enclosure. And I think Sam mentioned the idea of condo developers using commons a lot to talk about as a to talk about privatized space, but also as a euphemism for community. So in this way, these acts of enclosure remind us of the importance of reclaiming a radical understanding of commons and practice on a regular basis. We also know that practices that can be defined in terms of principles of commons and commoning have been inherent to local contexts across the globe for thousands of years. These do not use the term commons, but are inherently structured around communal relationships and collective spaces. So this leads to the next part of this work, which is guided by 3 questions. The first question is, what forms of collectivized relations to and in housing exist that inherently work in commoning ways without being named as such and without the application of commons as a term? The second question is, what are vernacular and localized relationships between these practices and how are these shaped and engaged with? And then my last question being, how do acts of commons enclosure operate, or the acts of enclosures operate at multiple scales? In terms of community-led housing models, I'm particularly interested in the crossover between practices and how these are produced by traditional and local contexts, and why and how they can move between global contexts. So for example, American community land trusts were inspired by the Grandin movement for communal land ownership that started in the 1950s across India. So interesting ideas of policy and thought mobility across continents. In beginning to think through these questions more globally, part of this project focuses on community housing practices in Senegal and the Gambia as a starting place. So I just have a few visuals that show communal living arrangements in community and organizational contexts from these 2 countries. And the last slides show my visit to the Neofar Eco Village, which is a communal living space that supports environmental practices. So I've got this sort of first slide up there. Good. So the first slides are of a family compound of my friend located just outside Banjul, the capital of the Gambia, in an area called Serekunda. The space is for extended families to share communal living quarters where each family has their own house within the compound. You can kind of move on to the second one. Sam, thanks. Families share cooking, child minding and elder care, washing, and other everyday activities, and contribute funds based on what they can afford on a monthly basis to a community account. And this account is then redistributed for housing and space repairs, food, clothes, and other items that family members need. Monthly meetings are then held where decisions are made about the community account and the reallocation of funds. Next slide. Good. So there's the example of the housing. It's joined together, and each family has their own house within the compound. We can move on to the next slide. So the large table is the community setting up for Haraway, which is a party that is regularly held to raise additional funds for the compound by selling tickets to family and friends who live outside of the community to attend Haraway events. And this is a way for fundraising for current and future activities and needs that the families in the compound have. And okay, so we can move on to the next slide. So the next photographs show another extended family compound in Malam, which is in the southern region of Casamance in Senegal. And these photos show the design of family houses and communal spaces in between such sort of outdoor cooking spaces, community garden, and shared compost for gardening. You can move on to the next slide. Yeah, this is the community garden. It's primarily designed for women who use this space. It's a new garden. And it connects with a community compost facility and is meant to be a productive space for food for the families that live in the compounds. We can move on to the next slide. Just some more than human members who are also part of the communal relationships of the family compounds. Move on to the next slide. Right. So these last slides show the Neofar eco-village in Casamance, which is the region I mentioned in southern Senegal. And this eco-village was started in 2018 as a French-Senegalese partnership. Neofar means we are all in it together in Wolof, which is the primary traditional language of Senegal. And the Neofar community primarily works to provide informal lodging for local community members and temporary housing for local students interested in environmental issues. It is a fully sustainable community with their own water well. You can move on to the next slide, which shows the water well. These are yeah, you can go on. There's the water well. And electricity entirely generated through solar infrastructure, which is the next slide, I think. So that's a battery for the solar panels. The space incorporates elements of the traditional family compounds, such as traditional houses constructed from mud, but also includes the redesign of shipping containers for housing. And move on to that's the shipping container that's actually forms the basis for a library with shared books and a space for work for students who come to the eco-village. So we can move on to the next slide. So greenery that helps with reducing runoff, where it rains quite heavily in the summer months in Senegal. You can move to the next slide. Okay. So Neofar is also involved in the recycling of plastic water bottles, which is a primary environmental concern in Senegal. So they work to repurpose plastic bottles into other items and reuse the bottles for the harvesting of palm wine and for growing plants. So you can move on. I think that's the last slide. Yeah. Neovar has an interesting land ownership arrangement because the land title was transferred to the formal Neofar organization by its two founders on a 100-year lease basis. So they have community land trust qualities, but don't self-identify as a land trust, which is quite common for eco-villages and quite interesting. This sort of using one model, but not naming it as such. So to conclude, this project suggests that we should not forward one universal definition of commons, but to understand it in terms of multiple sites and scales of communal practices with emphasis on the relational processes of commoning. It's important to look at the diverse meanings of collective effort, what the multiple and intersectional solidarities that ground these meanings are, and how are they enacted through spaces and through our connections with each other. So I'll leave it here, and then I think we're moving on to a lightning round of questions. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. I do have a few questions for you both, but two things I want to mention before we get into that. The first is something I should have tossed out there at the very beginning, but the Q&A field is open for any questions as they come up, so please put your thoughts in there and we'll hold some time at the very end to try and get through as many of those questions as possible. And then just in response to both of these fabulous presentations, I kind of want to just like try and bring it full circle. I think at a certain point, we use the term commons because it's out there, it's available. But I think as Susannah, Dr. Bunce points out, there are colonial legacies, connotations that are associated with the term. But I feel like it's important for us to sort of recognize that all of these practices, whether they show up in the Bay Area, in Toronto, locally, internationally, in Senegal, wherever, these strategies aren't even new. And there are so many ways that we can shift and decouple our perspectives from those racial, capitalist, colonial, patriarchal legacies that do not serve us collectively. Both of these examples show that you have shared with us, show that there are ways that we can put each other, centering radical compassion and our communities to the forefront, and ultimately this is, I think, the way forward. So I have a few more thoughts, but really, I don't need to hear from me. I want to hear more from the two of you. So I have prepared a few quick questions here for you both that I was hoping that we could get into, right? And again, to sort of help us wrap up here towards the end of our time together, let's try and close this gap between the theory and the practice, which you have both in your presentations. Really, I think illustrated how we can narrow that gap. But to really round it out, want to think about one idea, one principle. These three questions. What is an idea or principle about the commons that we should not compromise in our continued thinking here? What can we point to some institutional or structural barriers that really urgently need our rethinking or reconsideration? And then I know you've already both shared examples of this, but let's continue to talk about an idea, a project, a built example, policy, a teaching practice that gives us hope for the future as we look forward and work forward together. So, we don't have to answer these in any particular order, but wanted to toss these out for your responses. So, I don't know.
Do you want to go first, Karen?
Sure. I will say that I mean the one part of these questions is going to be hard, but I will say that in our work to answer the question about a principle about the commons and maybe just housing work and housing design work in general, I would say that it's critical to follow the lead of people who are most impacted by the issues that we're designing to confront. So that's why it was critical for us to work closely with older residents in West Oakland, and we were looking for larger ideas to look at schemes or platforms like the Homes Guarantee that themselves are put together by grassroots leaders. So that was one of the principles that was critical for us.
I think my answer to this question is around the importance of collective decision making. So we can't really compromise that when we're thinking reflexively around the commons. So working through things collectively and reflexively, being able to critically reflect on the successes of decision making, trying new forms of collective decision making. And thinking about who is there and who isn't. So who is included and who isn't in decision making, and then who is excluded and why. And I think those practices of decision making are sort of key to collectivity and communal practices. So I think that principle is at the core of the commons, but the decision making part is less. Is less discussed and less thought about, I think, in terms of the importance of it as a practice.
The decision making part is so important. And I mean, put another way, this is where governance structures, I think, become really important to all of these considerations and practices when put into action. But I feel like that's a discussion for another webinar entirely that we could really dig into. So then moving forward, what about barriers? What are the sort of challenges that we most frequently confront in your respective approaches, practices, work, research?
Maybe for that question, maybe I'll jump to the thing I mentioned briefly, which is the aging in place guide for building owners that I was commissioned to write with a massive group of experts for the city of New York. So that's certainly less radical than a lot of the things we're talking about today. But the reason that was produced, there was a sort of statement at the city level, the city council, and then it ended up later in our hands. That was because so much of work, so much of the guidance for design for aging is for individual homeowners. And so our charge was to put out guidelines for owners of multifamily buildings, of course, because in New York, the vast majority of the building stock is multifamily. So this is not the commons in some of the more radical ways that we're talking about, but it's the living in a shared building at least, right? And the critical barrier, so we at least made some moves in terms of putting out guidance that makes sense for multifamily buildings, but the saddest part of that booklet was at the end when we had resources and it was very weak. So as we, this all needs funding. And so thinking about funding that can be directed at multifamily buildings for aging in place upgrades, I think is absolutely critical.
Absolutely. And you started by saying that this is not radical, but I feel like these changes are so essential. It's not like the big sexy headline thing, but I think that these fundamental transformations are radical. Even just shifting that like centered perspective of individuality that is sort of just assumed. It is the wallpaper for everything that we do in the West, really. Um, and something that I think pops up in nefarious places unexpectedly all over the place. We certainly ran into maybe not the same issue, but it sort of touched on the same sore spot in some of the work that I've done with the Neighborhood Land Trust in Toronto. The systems and structures that exist all assume a single entity, one-to-one exchange program. And the way that, never mind the collective action of the Neighborhood Land Trust itself, but when we were going into some of our partnership deals, we were approaching funding bodies like CMHC with partners in hand. And the idea that there would be a third party to the agreement was totally unheard of and nearly derailed the whole exercise. And again, it points to these barriers around lack of resources. Even in instances where there are resources ostensibly available, how those programs are facilitated and doled out tends to assume that individualistic practice. So I just wanted to sort of share that and echo that that is, I think, quite radical. What the issue that you're pointing to. Um, Susannah, any
Mhm.
thoughts on your end?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think maybe starting with the idea of a barrier always implies that there's sort of something outside, something that's causing a tension or a complication, and so I think when I'm thinking about the comments, I don't necessarily think of sort of institutional barriers per se, and I don't really look at comments through an institutional lens, but more of a non-institutional lens, or thinking about comments as autonomous or semi-autonomous spaces. But also thinking about the tensions between institutional and non-institutional actors. And so I think there's always this imperative to scale up, which is something I'm thinking about more and more in relation to lots of different community-led housing models. And I think scaling up brings its own challenges around how far and how large something grows, and so why this imperative exists in the first place, and like at what tipping point scaling up becomes imbalanced, and then ends up replicating itself in terms of what practices is actually trying to resist and transform. So I think for community-led housing models, it's the need to receive sustainable funding from institutions, but also have the agency to have sovereignty over decisions around scale and how that works in practice. So what scale feels most comfortable and most sustainable to them becomes a key question and a key thought in terms of how to move forward in a sustainable way, giving the disparity in funding. So the concerns around growing up and feeling this pressure to scale up, but then what happens if funding is pulled at the scale at which the funding was given? How do you grow sustainably going forward with this sort of institutional funding precarity that a lot of community-led housing practices and processes are aligned on?
Absolutely. I think that so I'm just trying to like take notes and to organize my thoughts because there's so much that you guys are tossing out here. Um, I agree that the like compulsion towards scaling up is again another one of these sort of wallpaper features of capitalist colonial mindset. And I think we are seeing some, at least in the conversations that I'm exposed to, some at least opening to a degrowth mindset or challenging that assumed growth trajectory as the only thing that we can or should be pursuing. Um, and the other piece I sort of noted here is about institutions, and I grant that it's, I wrote the question, it's in the question there, um, and I appreciate how you sort of responded with some aversion to that, but similar to my opening thoughts on the commons and the thoughts that have permeated our whole conversation today, I would also encourage us to like challenge what do we think of as an institution, because we all have exposure to the capital I institutions, but my favorite institutions are like my Auntie Dot's dining room table. That's an institution. My Uncle Fred's oral histories and his stories of memories of the family. These are the institutions that are important to me. My weekly basketball game is an institution that is important to me. Um, and so I just wanted to again, like we can trouble and challenge all of these things, but just want to elevate the institutions of our collective shared experiences. These social institutions, I think, are very, very crucial to this whole conversation. Um, okay, then finally, for this moment, we have one last thought on the page here, and I'm not seeing any questions coming into the Q&A, so like, please don't be shy, folks. I will warn you, I do have more questions just in case. So I always have more questions. Anyways, um, and again, I know that I've written one idea or project here. We need not limit ourselves. Share
Okay,
any
good.
of your
I
thoughts.
have 75.
Okay,
Um,
excellent.
I do have a lot of hope, and I think there's amazing work happening, and specifically in the last 10 or so years, it's been astonishing what's been going on. A lot of stuff that was never all the experts who I hang out with would have said this is never possible. And maybe I'll just link to what Sam said about institutions. I think it's interesting, when I teach on this work and I ask my students to think about, just as we did in our Aging Against the Machine project, right? Oh, and I forgot, the machine is neoliberalism. I forgot to say that, but obviously. Anyways, so just as we were very, very, very adamant about building on the work that has happened historically and is happening now. When I ask my students to look at what's already great about the neighborhoods they're working on, often, the first things they jump to are at a higher level. Okay, here's this funding, here's this program, whatever, and it can be a bit. It takes some pulling to also engage with the smaller scale, the human assets, et cetera. So I think that's critical. In terms of hope, I have a lot of hope, and I'm going to stop myself from speaking in a monologue. But maybe one thing, so I spent the last 20 years in New York. New York has a long, long, long history of limited equity cooperatives. I've written a bit recently about the 1927 amalgamated cooperatives. And I think what's important there is to look at, there's many important things, but to look at the how it's both bottom up and top down, right? That was made possible because immigrants on the Lower East Side, et cetera, rallied and got a lot changed at the state level, which made that co-op possible, right? And now I think what's really encouraging is that residents in these co-ops have the opportunity to go market, right? They can exit, they can say, forget it, I want to get my cash, my unit is worth X, I need to retire to Florida, whatever. But over and over again, the majority of the limited equity co-ops in New York vote to stay permanently affordable. So I think seeing that's not always the case. Jonathan Tarleton has just written a great book profiling two different co-ops, and one, spoiler alert, does go market. So it's not like it's happening always, but I think that's great to see that people are actually voting for this. This is a continual process. And in terms of um, design, of course, maintenance is a massive issue. So there are many issues to think about in design. And one of them is longevity. You might have noticed that none of our interventions were saying, this is the cheapest possible. This is the fastest, cheapest possible. Those things are critical. And in thinking about the goal of permanent affordability, looking at durable, energy efficient, et cetera. I'll do one more and then, and then pass it along. I think what's also super exciting is what's going on in Seattle. So in Seattle, there were two votes at the city level. One was to establish the Social Housing Development Authority, and because of the city charter, there had to be a second vote to fund it. And the vote was whether they were going to fund it by taxing Microsoft and a bunch of, those mega companies. So you'll be unsurprised to learn that there was a massive, well-funded campaign against this. And despite all of that, this passed by 26%. So this is not just the idea of an academic webinar, right? This is happening. And in Seattle, it's also super exciting because there's a guy, Mike Eliason, an architect, a brilliant architect, who has shut down his firm to become head of design and development. And so that means that not only is this going to be an economically amazing idea, but it's going to be held to the highest design standards, passive house, looking at single stair, et cetera. So those are two in a long list of things that are making me hopeful.
Okay.
Ooh, I know you're
I just wanted
hopeful
to say I am hopeful. Yeah. I share Karen's hope. I just don't have as long of a list as Karen of ideas, but that was a really impressive list, Karen. So yeah, I mean this is an important question. I think it's hard to choose, of course, one experiment and one practice. And practices sort of connect with each other, as we know. So I think thinking about, I mean, maybe this is sort of a niche, these are niche ideas, but I'm increasingly interested in the use of the community land trust model in post-disaster contexts. So claiming or reclaiming community land ownership after ecological disasters such as wildfires that we've seen in the west coast of Canada, in the northern Ontario and Quebec, as well as the wildfires in California last year. In the context of wars, so thinking about the use of the CLT model, in sort of post-war context, post-genocide context, just to counter displacement. I think the community land trust model offers so many wonderful aspirational and practical ideas for how communities govern and own land collectively, which is why I've been working on community land trusts for a long time in relation to thinking about how land land can be moved away from the speculative market and away from this very dominant individualized private property ownership model that we have, a regime that we have and we live in. So I think thinking about in the increasing light of climate crisis, and the numerous types of ecological disasters we're going to be facing in the decades coming. I think thinking about communality, commons, the ways that we can practice collective land ownership is going to become much more important. And so yeah, I think the post-disaster landscape is a really important sort of terrain for thinking through ideas of housing commons. And then the second would be eco-villages, which I'm also interested in, as my presentation describes. And I always liked eco-villages, but just because they kind of operate as kind of a community-led housing landscape, and they often operate by themselves in kind of autonomous ways, even though there is a global eco-village network that operates on an international basis. It actually was created to start to reach out to all these different sort of autonomous eco-villages that were intentional and often operated sort of off grid, both literally and figuratively. So I think eco-villages offer a lot of hope, because it is a group of people who are interested in ecological practices coming together to own land, as I mentioned, not necessarily name it as a community land trust, but often have the qualities or shared characteristics of a community land trust, and coming together for the intention of farming together, growing food together, thinking about ecological practices that aren't necessarily imposed by a broader institutional framework of what ecological practice is or ecological governance is. So they do come up with their own kind of homegrown governance structures around decision making, around what kind of ecological practices they want to engage in. And so that's why I think they're actually quite fascinating. And I'm increasingly interested in the connections between sort of shared characteristics between CLTs and eco villages, and why they have historically been distinctive community-led housing models in their own kind of practices. So yeah.
Great. I want to link to that. And Sam, thanks for sharing that, the link to an article. So one of my favorite articles in my book is by Deborah Gans and Cynthia Barton and Rosamund Palmer. And just as you're speaking of, Susannah, this is the story. So this is Beyond Temporary Prototypes for Resilient Communities, looking at a disaster context. So one story that I think is really powerful is after Sandy, the big storm in 2012 in New York that flooded a lot of areas. The architect Deborah Gans worked with a working class community in Sheepshead Bay that lives in a series of bungalows. And there was no choice but to work on the redesign collectively. Because if you raise one property individually, you're just going to flood your neighbor, right? So, but speaking of barriers, every single working with funding streams from the feds all the way down to the city, everything, like Sam was talking about earlier, was geared toward individual owners. And so, in terms of what does design mean in this case, Deborah worked with her colleagues to design a process. She had to get buy-in, and this is not, I think what's also encouraging is, I'm talking about New York and Seattle, you could write these off and say, oh, those are blue states, whatever, blue cities, whatever. But I find it really interesting to see that these practices are emerging and growing across the political
Mhm.
spectrum. There's also really amazing community land trusts in Florida, for instance, which is not a blue state. So in this case, yeah, she had to fight at every level and to get a redesign that would be resilient for everyone. And it ended up being, looking at there was an easement that was held in common. The ownership was common, and so just using that structure as much as possible to create a redesign that would be flood resilient.
So
Fantastic. This is
interesting.
so yeah, so interesting. And thank you for sharing all of these incredible examples.
Mhm. I should
Keeping it
also
up.
say Indigenous and Black-led CLTs too, not necessarily in relation to post-disaster relief, but certainly there's so many fantastic examples of Black-led and Indigenous-led CLTs. There's Agoria Te Land Trust in California in the Bay Areas, such a wonderful example of not just Indigenous, but Indigenous women-led CLT practices in terms of collective land ownership and relationships to the lands, of healing through lands, growing food as a process and practice of healing. So there's lots of different wonderful examples in the
Absolutely.
North American context, but also Indigenous contexts across the world. So
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, it was making me think about Chesila Ribeiro's work in
yeah,
Brazil and in Puerto Rico. If you're interested in that, she was one of our guests on a past webinar, which you can view the recording of on our website, but I'll plug that at the end. Um, Realizing that we have only a little bit more time, we've really got an excellent question in the chat here from Sarah Cooper. So I'm going to read this out and ask you both to respond to this. So first of all, Sarah says, thank you both for these fantastic presentations, feeling very inspired and love the directions you're both taking and thinking about the possibilities for commons and commenting as an action. Um, could you say more about the importance of who gets to make decisions in building commons? She's thinking in particular about the complexity of making decisions about land in a settler colonial context, while also acknowledging the implications of white supremacist and capitalist policies. How do we navigate the many layers of building commons in this context, in these contexts? So something nice and meaty to end with, but really fantastic question. I think addresses so many issues that we can.
I guess I can jump in because it's a really good question and something that's top of my mind, as I mentioned in my first answer to the question, the set of questions that Sam posed. Decision making is hard, and then coming from a community development background, we spend a lot of time thinking about decision making and the practice of decision making, as well as particularly the micro relational practices of decision making. The silences, the microaggressions, the kind of who's at the table, who's not, types of questions that are really, I think, integral to thinking through sort of ways that communal spaces, collective living arrangements are decided upon. So I think it's a kind of $1 million question in a lot of ways. There's not really an answer to it. I think my where I'm leaning in sort of particularly in the context of fractured ties and connections with each other as a result of colonialism, of a long history of colonialism in the Canadian context and colonial violence. um, I think it really comes down again to sort of almost like an anti-scaling up approach and thinking about very small micro-relational spaces. Um, I'm increasingly convinced that having large communal spaces and collective spaces becomes more challenging to address the dysfunction of decision making. And small, sort of small as beautiful kind of approach allows us to have these more specific and determined types of intentional kind of conversations around how decisions should be made. And it takes a long time, as we know. And so I think, the scaling up imperative that we all are part of, this neo-modernist imperative to grow and to develop, um, so also puts a lot of constraint on our ability to make decisions. It puts a lot of time constraints on the process of decision making. And that being said, decisions often have to be made quickly, particularly in a policy context. But I think when we're thinking about community and collective decision making, it really needs to be slow. And so in order to be able to be reflexive. And so the sort of notion of reflexivity is really important, not just sort of reflexivity on a community basis, but or community scale, but also in terms of how we position ourselves as individuals within that collective discussion. And what we bring to the table, our own agendas, how we converse with each other, all of those kind of communicative ideas and practices are really sort of should be front and center in how decision making is thought of and also reflected upon. I hope that is a sort of short answer to a very important question. But Karen, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I would say yes. And I think it's critical to appreciate the smallest community land trust, the smallest co-op. I think, those are really important. Um, and also, coming from New York, we have Co-op City, which is 43,000 residents and maintains, the leadership is still, lower income people of color. And it's gone through, certainly there have been some issues over the years. But I think this can also operate at at scale. And I'm excited. I'm going to be going to Montevideo, to Uruguay soon. You know, they have over 50 years of cooperatives there, also at a larger scale. So I think yes, and on that. And in terms of, and I should mention, you know, I'm giving some mostly U.S. examples because that's where most of my work has been. But I'm a proud member of the Kensington Market Neighborhood Land Trust, and really, really excited to see what's going on in Canada. It's really phenomenal what's happening. So in terms of resident control, I will say, you know, in my own work, I look both at cooperatives, you know, community land trusts that are more resident-led, and also I think you know, my work doesn't let the government off the hook. So also looking at you know, talking about the role of government in these questions, and also looking at larger scales of social housing. And I'm just pulling up the Community Service Society's definition of social housing, which is has three aspects: decommodification, social equality, and resident control. So resident control being part of that. And maybe I'll just give one, you know, there are, I think the question in the Q&A needs to be addressed. You know, I think the answers of how to address that will differ based on the situation. I want to mention something that I learned is not legal in Canada, but how it works in New York. So Cooper Square is the oldest community land trust in New York. It took 50 years of organizing to make it happen. And again, led by, you know, lower income people of color. And so this is the way that they maintain resident control, is by having a very complicated system on purpose. So the buildings are owned by a mutual housing association, which has one, you know, resident-led governance. The land, and I understand it can't be separated in Canada, but the land is run by the land trust, which has a separate board, separate leadership. So what that means is, you know, in terms of for the goal of permanent affordability. So that means, let's say the residents say, whatever, I'm selling, I'm getting out of here, I'm moving to Tahiti, whatever. They can't without the agreement of the board of the land trust, because they can't sell their building without the land. So that's just one example, but I think looking very carefully at the agreements, the systems that have worked over decades can give us options that you know, really ensure resident control over the long term.
Absolutely. And as you're just describing that like complex governance structure, again, could be a whole webinar discussion on its own, but it reminds me of how the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust and the Neighborhood Land Trust are associated, that there is a sort of community informed side of the board that, for the sake of a simple metaphor, sort of steers the ship. And then there is a more professionally oriented, more professionally oriented board on the Neighborhood Land Trust who like power the ship. And it's the working relationship between these two entities that I think really makes it robust. Yes, it's complicated, but complicated is not necessarily a bad thing. And you know, most things worth doing are not necessarily easy or straightforward. So with that, the last thought that I've written down throughout all of these notes in my little notebook here is this thought that, you know, what it comes down to is that ultimately all we have is us, and we need to figure out how to work together. And with that said, you know, I'm just so happy, fulfilled to be here with these amazing women on our panel today, all of the people I get to work with at the HCRC, and of course, everybody in the audience who has taken time out of their days to join us today. So big thanks to each and every one of you. Just to sort of close up, you know, it's just, again, so important that we continue to have these conversations, share knowledge across disciplines, across contexts. And that's exactly what the Housing Commons Research Center is here to do. Again, we're a platform for this ongoing exchange in across mediums, not a single conversation. So as I mentioned, our past webinars are available on YouTube, and you can find links to those on the Housing Commons Research Center website. Um, we will be having our next webinar. I believe the date is May 28th,
May
so the
28th.
end of the month. But you'll be seeing updates certainly about that. We'll be sharing the recording of this conversation if you want to tell a friend, share it with your relatives, other people, whoever, show your mom. And as always, we are here to host conversations. If you want to stay involved, sign up to our mailing list. We'll send updates out to everybody who is on the call today. And yeah, just finally, like, thanks for being here, everybody. Really appreciate you all. So I suppose that, oh, I'm
Thanks, Sam.
seeing,
Thanks, everyone.
yeah, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks so much. Yeah, working collectively is the only way forward.
That's right. You heard it. Okay. Um, I, yeah.